He was born in 1992. So was an entire generation of Korean idols who came up around the same time. So why does one name keep surfacing whenever fans debate who looks the most grown in K-pop? Why does a man who has spent over a decade dancing under stage lights, sweating through choreography, and living the same relentless idol schedule as his group mates somehow read to millions of viewers as the one who belongs in a different room, a boardroom, a lecture hall, a black and white film from another era? Is it the jawline? Is it the way he carries himself? Or is it something else entirely, something buried not in his face, but in the way an entire culture defines what older even means? And if the answer isn't really about looks at all, what is it really about? That's the question this video is built around. Not to mock him, not to reduce a person to a meme, but to actually dig into why Seokjin, known to the world as Jin, became the face people point to when they talk about maturity in BTS. Somewhere between genetics, biography, culture, and branding, there's a real answer, and it's more interesting than he just looks like that. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics carry more weight than people realize. Jin was born on December 4, 1992, in Anyang, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea. Of the 7 members of BTS, he's the oldest, not by a landslide. The full lineup runs from his birth year in 1992 down to Jungkook's in 1997, less than 5 years separating the eldest from the youngest. But in the internal culture of a K-pop group, 5 years is an ocean, and Jin sits right at the edge of it, permanently cast as the hyung, the older brother of the group. Here's the first open loop, and it's one we won't close until later. The maturity people see in Jin isn't just about his face. It's about a role he was handed the moment BTS formed and how thoroughly he leaned into it. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. But first, we need to deal with something that trips up a lot of international fans the moment they start digging into Jin's age, because on paper, in the West, Jin is not actually that old. For most of BTS's early career, Western fans calculated Jin's age the way they calculate anyone's age, birth year subtracted from the current year. Simple. Except that's not how age has traditionally been counted in Korea. Under the old Korean age system, used widely for most of BTS's active years before the country moved to standardize international age counting in 2023, a person is considered 1 year old at birth and gains a year every New Year's Day, not on their birthday. That system could make Jin and every other Korean idol sound significantly older in fan conversations than their actual international age suggested. So that's fact number 1. Part of the he seems older perception was never about how Jin looked at all. It was a numbers problem baked into how an entire country talked about age before the law changed. But numbers only explain so much, because even fans who understand the Korean age system perfectly still describe Jin as looking like, carrying himself, and behaving like the most mature member of BTS. So there's clearly something else going on, and to understand it, we have to go back before BTS existed at all, to a version of Seokjin who had absolutely no interest in becoming an idol. This is where the story gets genuinely surprising, because Jin's path into BTS wasn't the typical one. Most K-pop idols spend their teenage years as trainees, dancing, singing, and living inside an agency system for years before they ever debut. Jin's path looked almost nothing like that. He wasn't hunting for a spot in an idol group. He was a university student with his sights on acting. Jin's first brush with the entertainment industry actually came years before Big Hit ever found him. While he was still in middle school, a scout from SM Entertainment approached him on the street, drawn to his looks. He turned the offer down. He assumed, reasonably enough for a teenager with no context, that it might be a scam. Years later, while he was enrolled at Konkuk University studying film and acting, fate tapped him on the shoulder a second time. A casting representative from Big Hit Entertainment, the company that would go on to build BTS, spotted him walking down the street and approached him. This time, he said yes. But here's the detail people often skip past. He didn't audition to become a singer. He auditioned as an actor. Music wasn't the plan. Big Hit saw something in his presence and pulled him toward performing anyway, eventually training him from scratch as a vocalist. Think about what that means. While future group mates were logging years in dance studios and vocal booths as young teenagers, Jin was in university, imagining a future in film with no formal background in singing or dancing at all. He came into this industry later and from a completely different direction than almost anyone else in his own group. Does that explain why he looks mature? Not directly, but it explains something almost as important, why Jin has always carried himself with a slightly different energy than a lifelong idol trainee might. He wasn't shaped inside the machine from adolescence. He walked into it as a young adult, already partway through building an entirely different identity. That timeline alone puts him on a different developmental clock than group mates who entered the trainee system years earlier. He graduated from Konkuk University with a degree in film studies on February 22, 2017, years into his idol career, after juggling BTS's punishing schedule alongside coursework. His bandmates were reportedly so invested in that milestone that they held their own small graduation celebration for him, cap and gown included. It's a strange human detail buried inside a global pop phenomenon. One of the most recognized performers on the planet was still finishing his bachelor's degree while headlining world tours. Now here's where we open our second loop of the video, because it connects directly to the maturity conversation. Jin didn't wait for the public to hand him an identity around his age and looks. He built one himself, deliberately, publicly, and with a sense of humor that a lot of people miss. The nickname Worldwide Handsome is one of the most recognizable phrases attached to any member of BTS, and contrary to what some assume, it wasn't invented by a magazine, a fan poll, or a marketing team. Jin coined it himself, tongue firmly in cheek, during interviews, most famously introducing himself with a version of the phrase during an appearance on The Ellen Show in 2018. Fans and international media loved it instantly, and it stuck so completely that it's now treated almost as an official title. That single choice tells you a lot about how Jin has approached his own image. Rather than letting outside voices define what his face and presence meant, he grabbed the narrative first, exaggerated it into a joke, and let the joke become iconic. It's a small piece of self-branding, but it reveals real self-awareness, the instinct of someone who understands optics and plays with them, rather than being played by them. And self-awareness delivered with confidence reads as maturity. That's not a coincidence. That's a skill. But there's a structural piece of this puzzle that has nothing to do with jokes or branding at all, and everything to do with how Korean culture assigns roles based on birth order, a system so ingrained that it shapes group dynamics whether members want it to or not. In Korean social culture, being the oldest in a friend group, a workplace, or an idol group comes with built-in expectations. Younger members are expected to show a certain deference. Older members are expected to take on a protective, sometimes parental posture. The language itself enforces it. Hyung, the term BTS's younger members use for Jin, isn't just a nickname, it's a marker of hierarchy baked directly into the grammar of respect. From the very beginning of BTS, Jin was cast into that hyung role almost automatically, simply by being the eldest. And over more than a decade of interviews, variety show appearances, and behind-the-scenes footage, fans have watched him lean into that position again and again, checking in on the younger members, diffusing tension with humor, and quietly absorbing the kind of responsibility that culturally attaches itself to being the oldest one in the room. That's the second open loop starting to close. Maturity, in Jin's case, isn't only a visual read, it's a behavioral one, reinforced by an entire cultural framework that expects the eldest member of any Korean group to act like the eldest member. Audiences pick up on that pattern even when they can't name why. A calm, steady, joke-cracking presence who seems to be quietly managing the room doesn't just look older, he performs older in the most literal structural sense because his culture has handed him that script since day one. But scripts only carry a performer so far. What actually built Jin's public identity over the past decade is a body of real, verifiable work, and is worth pausing here, because this is where some of the drama gets earned honestly instead of manufactured. Jin has released 3 solo tracks with BTS across the group's catalog: Awake in 2016, Epiphany in 2018, and Moon in 2020, each of which charted on South Korea's Gaon digital chart. These weren't side projects tossed off for filler. They were emotionally weighted ballads that gave Jin space to carry a song entirely on his own voice without 6 other performers sharing the spotlight. Then, in 2022, Jin stepped even further outside the group's shadow. He collaborated with the British band Coldplay on the single The Astronaut, a partnership that put a BTS member's solo work directly alongside one of the biggest rock acts in the world. The song charted on the Billboard Hot 100, landing at number 51 in its debut week, a real certified data point, not fan exaggeration. And here's a detail worth sitting with. The Astronaut wasn't released in a quiet moment of Jin's career. It came out right before one of the most significant transitions any member of BTS would face: mandatory military service. Here comes our forward-pointing tension line, because what happens next changes the entire shape of Jin's public story. This is only the beginning of understanding why the eldest narrative around him hardened into something almost mythic. What happened over the following 18 months is the part a lot of casual fans never fully followed in real time. Under South Korean law, able-bodied men are required to complete mandatory military service, historically between the ages of 18 and 28. In 2020, in direct response to BTS's global cultural impact, South Korea's National Assembly revised the Military Service Act, allowing high-achieving entertainers to postpone their enlistment until the age of 30. It was quite literally a rule created because of what BTS had already accomplished on the world stage. But a postponement only lasts so long, and because Jin was the eldest member of the group, he was the first to hit that ceiling. Jin enlisted on December 13, 2022, becoming the very first member of BTS to begin his military service. For 18 months, while the group's global machine paused, Jin trained at a base in Yeoncheon, Gyeonggi Province, close to the border with North Korea, stepping away entirely from music, cameras, and the identity the world had built around him. He was discharged on June 12, 2024. That single fact, Jin first in, Jin first out, did something powerful to his public image, whether or not it was ever designed to. It physically, chronologically confirmed the role he'd always occupied inside the group. He wasn't just called the eldest as a nickname, he was legally, structurally required to be first through one of the most defining, unavoidable transitions any young Korean man faces. The internal culture of the group and the external law of the country lined up perfectly, and the result reinforced in the most concrete way possible that Jin really does exist one step ahead of his groupmates on the timeline of adulthood. The discharge itself became one of the most emotional moments of Jin's public career, and it's worth walking through honestly, because this is where the mature image and the real human being underneath it meet. According to reporting from outlets present that day, Jin was visibly emotional as he embraced fellow service members at the base in Yeoncheon. Wearing his uniform and a black beret, he later addressed fans directly during a live stream on the platform Weavers that drew millions of views. He said he had cried during the discharge ceremony, and that despite the difficulty of the 18 months, he had found real friendship among the people he served alongside. Waiting for him outside the base were several of his BTS bandmates, RM, J-Hope, Jimin, V, and Jungkook, who had been granted leave to celebrate the moment. Reports describe RM playing the group's hit single Dynamite on a saxophone as Jin walked out. It's a small, specific image, but it carries weight. The group's youngest and middle members physically showing up to mark the return of the one member culturally positioned above all of them. That's not manufactured content. That's not a fan theory. That's a documented, witnessed event. And it says something real about how deeply the hyung framework runs through this group, well past any stage performance. Now, let's step back and look at the piece of this puzzle that lives entirely on the surface: how Jin is actually styled, marketed, and visually positioned within BTS. From the group's earliest days, Jin was introduced not just as a vocalist, but specifically as a visual, industry language for the member whose face and presence anchor a group's aesthetic identity. That designation shaped how stylists, photographers, and creative directors treated him across a decade of album cycles, music videos, and magazine features. He has fronted high-fashion editorial spreads, including a widely discussed Vogue Korea cover, often styled in cleaner, more classically elegant looks, rather than the more youthful, high-energy styling sometimes given to some of BTS's younger members. None of that happened by accident. Visual branding in K-pop is deliberate, and agencies actively lean into whatever image reads strongest for a given performer. If audiences and stylists alike consistently gravitated toward describing Jin's features as classic or timeless rather than boyish, that perception got reinforced magazine after magazine cover until it calcified into a defining trait of his public identity. It's worth being fair here and separating two different things that often get blurred in fan discussions: genuine physical maturity and constructed visual branding. Jin's features are his own. Bone structure and expression aren't something a stylist invents, but how those features get framed, lit, dressed, and positioned next to 6 other young men is absolutely a business decision, repeated consistently enough to shape how millions of viewers perceive him. That's the more complete answer this video has been building toward. It's not one single explanation, it's a stack of them layered on top of each other, a Korean age-counting system that confused international fans for years, a later and completely different entry point into the entertainment industry than its groupmates experienced, a cultural hierarchy that structurally requires the eldest member to act like the eldest member, a self-aware sense of humor that let him claim his own image before anyone else could define it, a legal and military timeline that made him first in the most literal sense, and a visual branding strategy built consistently around a more classic, mature aesthetic. Strip away any one of those pieces, and the "he looks older" narrative gets noticeably weaker. Put them all together, and it becomes almost inevitable that this is the perception that formed. But this is only the beginning of understanding the full picture, because there's one more piece worth being fair about, and it's the part where public opinion sometimes gets ahead of the actual evidence. Some critics and casual observers have gone further than the facts support, occasionally implying that Jin's more mature image somehow reflects a gap in charisma or youthful energy compared to his groupmates, as though mature were a polite way of saying less exciting. That's a claim worth examining rather than accepting outright, because it doesn't hold up particularly well against the record. Jin has consistently been cited by fans and fellow members alike as one of the primary sources of humor inside BTS. The one cracking dad jokes mid-interview, blowing exaggerated air kisses at cameras, and turning ordinary variety segments into some of the group's most replayed comedic moments. Maturity and playfulness aren't opposites for him. They sit side by side, often in the same sentence. Painting him purely as the serious grown-up one flattens a personality that's actually built on contrast, steady and composed one moment, deliberately ridiculous the next. It's a claim worth holding gently rather than treating as settled, because mature versus fun was never really the right framework to begin with. The more accurate read is that Jin figured out early how to hold both at once and let each side sharken the other. Now we arrive at the moment this entire video has been circling, the piece of Jin's story that ties the visual, the cultural, and the deeply personal together and closes the emotional loop we opened all the way back at the start. Go back to that image from Yeoncheon, Jin in uniform, admitting on a live stream watched by millions that he'd cried during his discharge ceremony. Not performing composure, not managing an image, just telling the truth live to a fan base that had spent 18 months waiting for him. That moment matters because it's the clearest evidence available that everything discussed in this video, the hung role, the worldwide handsome branding, the classic styling, the eldest first military timeline, sits on top of an actual person, not a character built for cameras. The maturity people project on Jin isn't a mask covering something younger and raw underneath. If anything, it's the opposite. The rawness is right there, openly the moment the cameras catch him off guard. He cried. He said so himself, without hesitation, to millions of strangers. That's not what image management usually looks like. That's what an actual grown adult, comfortable enough in himself, being honest in public looks like. And maybe that, more than any jawline or Vogue cover, is the real answer to the question this video opened with. Jin doesn't just look mature. In the moments that count most, he behaves like someone who has genuinely done the internal work of growing up in front of the entire world. Awkward university years, late entry into an industry he didn't originally choose, 18 months of military service, and a decade of being the one everyone else leaned on, all included. That's the loop closed. Not a trick of lighting, not a coincidence of birth year. A pattern built deliberately and accidentally at the same time by a person who turned out to be exactly as steady as he looks. We're almost at the end of this story, but before we close, it's worth sitting for a moment on what all of this actually adds up to, not just for Jin, but for how audiences think about idols in general. It's easy from the outside to reduce a public figure down to a single trait, the handsome one, the funny one, the mature one, and stop looking any further. BTS has spent over a decade proving, repeatedly, that those labels are starting points, not conclusions. Jin's story is maybe the clearest example of that inside the group. He didn't arrive as the mature member by design. He became associated with it through a specific, traceable combination of birth order, a culture that assigns real weight to being the eldest, and a legal system that made him first through one of the hardest transitions in Korean adulthood, an industry that leaned into a certain kind of visual branding, and a personal choice to make all of it with humor instead of resentment. None of that erases the parts of him that are still, by every account from the people who know him best, playful, occasionally goofy, and deeply attached to the people around him. The eldest label and the class clown label were never actually in competition. Jin simply proved, over and over, that a person can hold both. To BTS's members, he's hyung, the one who checks in, the one who softens hard moments with a bad joke at exactly the right time. To millions of fans around the world, he's worldwide handsome, a title he built himself and handed to the public with a wink. And to the country he served, for 18 months starting in December 2022, he was simply a soldier fulfilling an obligation no fame could exempt him from. Maybe the real answer to why does Jin look more mature than the other members was never really about looking older at all. Maybe it was about a person who, by circumstance and by choice, kept ending up first scouted, first to graduate, first to enlist, first to come home, and who met every one of those moments with enough steadiness that an entire fandom started reading it as an aesthetic, when really it was just a life being lived a few steps ahead of the rest. If this is the version of Jin you've come to admire, not just the face, but the timing, the resilience, and the humor tucked right underneath it, tell us in the comments which moment in his story actually changed how you see him, not the one everyone already knows, the one that surprised you.